Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. Michael Mann claimed that he won the Nobel Prize, but he didn't. His Nobel Prize was just as fake as his science. This is the lawsuit which he filed against Mark Stein. This claim was in the lawsuit. Dr. Mann is a climate scientist whose research has focused on global warming. Along with other researchers, he was one of the first to document the steady rise in surface temperatures during the 20th century and the steep increase in measured temperatures since the 1950s. As a result of this research, Dr. Mann and his colleagues were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And here was Michael Mann's Nobel Prize in his office window. But the director of the Nobel Institute had a completely different story. 1. Michael Mann has never been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. 2. He did not receive any personal certificate. He has taken the diploma awarded in 2007 to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and to Al Gore and made his own text underneath this authentic-looking diploma. 3. The text underneath the diploma is entirely his own. We issued only the diploma to the IPCC as such. No individuals on the IPCC side received anything in 2007. Very few people attempt to fraudulently claim in a court of law that they won the Nobel Peace Prize, but Michael Mann is an exception. Now let's look at the other part of his claim. He was one of the first to document the steady rise in surface temperatures during the 20th century. And there's his hockey stick. He showed temperatures slowly cooling for nearly 1,000 years, until CO2 levels hit 301 parts per million, and then all heck broke loose. Apparently that last part per million going from 300 parts per million up to 301 parts per million was the tipping point. That set off a catastrophic rise in temperatures. Michael Mann's hockey stick looked very different from what the National Center for Atmospheric Research showed in 1974. They showed the world getting much cooler after the 1940s, and that in fact 1970 was cooler than 1870. July 21, 1974, Des Moines Sunday Register. World is getting cooler. Droughts, floods, blizzards, tornadoes, typhoons, and hurricanes have plagued much of the nation and the world in recent years. Most people consider these weather conditions to be abnormal and temporary, but instead, climatologists now believe that the first half of the 20th century was blessed with an unusually mild weather and that the global climate has begun returning to a harsher but more normal state. For the long run, there is mounting evidence of a worldwide cooling trend. The average temperature of the world as a whole has dropped by 1/3 to 1/2 a degree centigrade in the last 30 years. The decline of prevailing temperatures since about 1945 appears to be the longest continued downward trend since temperature records began, says Professor Hubert H. Lamb of the University of East Anglia in Britain. Global cooling may be the cause of the devastating African drought, now in its 6th year. Some scientists believe that expansion of the cold polar air caps pushed the monsoon rain belt southward, causing many of the life-giving rains to fall on already fertile lands or into the sea. Dry weather conditions also prevail in parts of India, China, Kenya, Bolivia, and other countries on both sides of the equator, raising the specter of even more serious drought and famine. Drought has hit the United States regularly about every 20 years and is due again in the mid-1970s. So in 1974, droughts, floods, blizzards, tornadoes, typhoons, and hurricanes were blamed on global cooling, the same things which climate scientists now blame on global warming. Now compare what that article said to what Michael Mann is saying now. He was one of the first to document the steady rise in surface temperatures during the 20th century. In 1974, the National Center for Atmospheric Research and many other scientists said the exact opposite of what Mann was claiming. They showed a very sharp decline in temperatures after the 1940s, such that 1970 was cooler than 1870. In 1975, the National Academy of Sciences showed the same thing. They showed a sharp cooling after the 1940s, a cooling which Michael Mann has erased. Michael Mann turned this large amount of cooling after the 1940s back to below 1870 levels into a little tiny cooling blip. In 1961, the New York Times reported that there was a unanimous consensus among scientists that Earth was cooling. An assembly of specialists from several continents seems to have reached unanimous agreement on only one point: it is getting colder. National Geographic published this article in 1976. And just what is going on with the climate? What changes are taking place around us? From 1880 to about 1940, the world, particularly the northern hemisphere, went through a period of significant warming. I heard from a tall, quiet-spoken Dr. J. Murray Mitchell, Jr. of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. He's one of the nation's most respected climatologists. He went on, but since about 1940 there has been a distinct drop in average global temperature. It's fallen about half a degree Fahrenheit, even more on high latitudes of the northern hemisphere. England's annual growing season shrank by 9 or 10 days between 1950 and 1966, Hubert Lamb has noted. In the northern tier of the U.S. Midwest, summer frosts again occasionally damage crops. Sea ice has returned to Iceland's coast after more than 40 years of virtual absence. During the last 20 to 30 years, world temperature has fallen, irregularly at first but more sharply over the last decade. U.S. National Science Board, 1974. Glaciers in Alaska and Scandinavia have slowed the recession. Some in Switzerland have begun advancing again. Let's look at this sentence again. Sea ice has returned to Iceland's coast after more than 40 years of virtual absence. Well, ice doesn't lie, but Michael Mann does. Obviously, the world was getting cooler. This was the cover of Science News on March 1st, 1975. The Ice Age cometh, glaciers plowing through Manhattan. The cover of the Chicago Tribune on the following day. Brr, new ice age on way soon. In the last decade, the Arctic ice and snowcap has expanded 12%, and for the first time in this century, ships making for Iceland ports have been impeded by drifting ice. Many climatologists see these signs as evidence that a significant shift in climate is taking place, a shift that could be the forerunner of an ice age like that which gripped much of the northern hemisphere before retreating 10,000 years ago. And here's The Guardian, January 29, 1974. Space satellites show new ice age coming fast. New York Times, December 29, 1974. A number of climatologists whose job it is to keep an eye on long-term weather changes have lately been predicting deterioration of the benign climate to which we have grown accustomed. They point to signs both great, a steady global cooling trend since World War II, and quaint, the southward retreat from Nebraska of the warmth-loving armadillo, to support their claim that the coming years will feature colder, more erratic weather. Some recent warnings from reputable researchers in Japan, Europe, and the U.S. have so worried policymakers that last January, certain scientists at a meeting of the National Academy of Sciences proposed the evacuation of some 6 million people from their parched homelands in the Sahel region of Africa. So scientists wanted to rescue 6 million people from global cooling, and they also wanted to melt the Arctic ice cap to stop the cooling trend. Newsweek, April 28, 1975. Science, the cooling world. Climatologists are pessimistic that political leaders will take any positive action to compensate for the climatic change or even to allay its effects. They concede that some of the more spectacular solutions proposed, such as melting the Arctic ice cap by covering it with black soot or diverting Arctic rivers, might create problems far greater than those they solve. Why didn't we listen to the scientists and melt the Arctic 45 years ago? New York Times, January 5, 1978. International team of specialists finds no end in sight to 30-year cooling trend in the northern hemisphere. Here's a letter which 42 top scientists wrote to President Nixon in 1972. Dear Mr. President, aware of your deep concern with the future of the world, we feel obliged to inform you on the results of the scientific conference held here recently at Brown University. The conference dealt with the past and future changes of climate and was attended by 42 top American and European investigators. We enclose the summary report published in Science, and further publications are forthcoming in quaternary research. The main conclusion of the meeting was that a global deterioration of the climate, by order of magnitude larger than any hitherto experienced by civilized mankind, is a very real possibility, and indeed may be due very soon. The cooling has a natural cause and falls within the rank of processes which produced the last ice age. Then I'll skip down here. The present rate of the cooling seems fast enough to bring glacial temperatures in about a century, if continuing at the present pace. But wait a minute, Michael Mann said there was a steady rise in surface temperatures during the 20th century. He couldn't have lied about that, could he? So we have pretty good indication that the blade of Mann's hockey stick is fraudulent. What about the left side of the graph? This was the global temperature graph from the 1990 IPCC report made just a few years prior to Mann's hockey stick. It showed something completely different. The 1990 graph looked nothing like a hockey stick. It showed the period around 1200 AD is much warmer than the present, and there was no blade. There was a very strong medieval warm period and a very strong little ice age. There's huge amounts of evidence that there was a medieval warm period and that there was a little ice age, and that Michael Mann is committing fraud. I don't want to get into a great amount of detail about that right now, but let's look at one piece of evidence: the history of glaciers in Glacier National Park from the USGS. The history of glaciation within current Glacier National Park boundaries spans centuries of glacial growth and recession, carving the features we see today. Glaciers were present within current Glacier National Park boundaries as early as 7,000 years ago, but may have survived an early Holocene warm period, making them much older. These modest glaciers varied in size, tracking climatic changes, but did not grow to their Holocene maximum size until the end of the Little Ice Age, around AD 1850. While they may not have formed in their entirety during the Little Ice Age, their maximum perimeters can be documented through mapping of lateral and terminal moraines. The extent and mass of these glaciers, as well as glaciers around the globe, has clearly decreased during the 20th century in response to warmer temperatures. This is the key sentence. These modest glaciers varied in size, tracking climatic changes, but did not grow to their Holocene maximum size until the end of the Little Ice Age, around AD 1850. Now look closely at this sentence. While they may not have formed in their entirety during the Little Ice Age. What they're telling us is that the glaciers grew rapidly during the Little Ice Age and may not have existed at all prior to the Little Ice Age, which would have been the medieval warm period. Now let's compare this description to the 1990 IPCC graph. Glaciers were smaller, non-existent during the medieval warm period, and they formed during the Little Ice Age. It makes perfect sense. But the behavior of the ice makes no sense in the context of Mann's hockey stick, because there was no Little Ice Age and there was no medieval warm period. Ice doesn't lie, but Michael Mann does. But here's the punchline. In 2006, Dr. David Deming of the University of Oklahoma testified to the Senate that he was told that scientists wanted to get rid of the medieval warm period. He said, "I had another interesting experience around the time my paper in Science was published, 1995. I received an astonishing email from a major researcher in the area of climate change. He said, 'We have to get rid of the medieval warm period.' And they found just the guy to do their dirty work for him, Michael Mann, the fake Nobel Prize guy. But there's something else incredible about the hockey stick which I alluded to briefly at the beginning of the video. Mann's hockey stick shows steady, slow global cooling until the atmosphere reached 301 parts per million CO2. And then all heck broke loose. Temperatures started skyrocketing upwards really fast. So 301 parts per million CO2 must be the tipping point. The implication being that in order to stop global warming, we would have to go all the way back to pre-industrial levels of CO2. If we believe his graph, then any time carbon dioxide is above 301 parts per million, temperatures are going to skyrocket. No more cars or airplanes or lights or yacht rides for Greta or trips to the UN or trips to the US Congress. We'd have to go back to a really primitive state of living. George Orwell said, "So much of left-wing thought is a kind of playing with fire by people who don't even know that fire is hot." Climate alarmists have no idea how dangerous their games and their lies are. Their lifestyle and livelihood is completely dependent on having responsible politicians who don't listen to them. But now there's a lot of politicians who seem to want to act on this madness. They want to take us back to pre-industrial levels of CO2. These people need to be stopped. And Michael Mann needs to be exposed for the fraud that he is. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.